The larger contextual issues include rising inequality and what many consider as unrepresentative political class. News outlets included. Chileans took to the streets of Santiago on Friday, pouring by their thousands into plazas and clashing violently with security forces as the protests that have shaken the country showed no signs of letting up. Security forces in armored vehicles dispersed the crowds with tear gas and water cannons, and protesters responded by hurling rocks and paint at the vehicles. Unrest in Chile continues after more than a week of riots, arson and protests over inequality that have resulted in at least 20 dead and 7,000 arrested so far. On October 7th, the day after the new fares came into effect, students launched a campaign to dodge them, jumping turnstiles on the Santiago metro in civil disobedience. Chilean businesses have lost more than $1.4 billion since the uprising began. The city's metro suffered nearly $400 million in damages. Protests over a hike in metro fares spun out of control earlier this month, prompting government to pledge sweeping social and economic reforms and to append cabinet. The country's Human Rights Institute has so far filed 167 judicial cases against armed forces over violence, including sexual assault and torture. United Nations investigators arrived earlier this week to probe the rights abuse allegations. Chilean officials, including the president, have welcomed their presence, saying they have nothing to hide.
For more on the story, we are now joined via Skype from Santiago, Chile, by Professor Pascale Bonnefoy, a professor of journalism at the University of Chile. Prof, good evening, and thank you so much for joining us on the Globe.
Good evening.
Now, Prof, is Chile in danger of, a repeat of the past during Pinochet's rule?
Well, we hope not. There was this image of the military on the streets the first week when President Piñera declared the state of emergency, and that heightened tensions, especially with older generations who lived through dictatorship, but not the younger ones. The younger ones were actually challenging the military on the streets, coming up to them, shouting at them, and not even respecting curfew. But I don't think this is a situation that would once again promote or provoke coup. The military has already gone back to its barracks, and much of the police, or what the brutality that many people have seen, the human rights violations these past couple of weeks, come mainly from the police.
Now, there have been reports of police brutality and, the reaction from the protesters is not backing down and continuing with the protests. We've seen a march of silence, which kicked off another day of protest today, and this was led by the women of Chile.
Exactly. Yesterday's because it was the All Saints Day. It was a holiday yesterday. So a large group of women organized a silent march through the streets of Santiago. But parallel to many other marches, there was a group of people who marched hundreds of kilometers from the coast to downtown Santiago area. And the protests have been continuing almost every day at some point or another. And what has been interesting is that I seem to feel that we're in a phase 2 right now with the protests simultaneously to the protests or cabildo, or local assemblies taking place all over the country. In which citizens, there's already like about 10,000 have been held. And citizens are asked to discuss three basic questions. One about the origins of the discontent, another where we can go from now, and a third about what our priority issues are. So while keeping up the momentum of the protests, which end up usually mostly provoked by the police, I have to say, because the looting and the fire, the arson attacks, they haven't, past few days we haven't seen much of that. It's been mainly police breaking up peaceful demonstrations. So parallel to all these demonstrations, we have local assemblies in which citizens are trying to come up with some sort of collective list of demands for the state.
Now, protesters' biggest contention seem to be, calling for drastic change in the social and economic makeup of Chile, and the fact that people are very furious over issues like pensions for the poor, privatization of healthcare. Just talk to us about those issues and what they're bringing to the table and the reaction from government and the leadership.
Okay. Well, there's so many issues that there's no way to put them just in one sole demand. And the movement has also been leaderless. So on the one hand, there's no leader or organization to negotiate with. And on the other, there's so many different demands, as you say, mainly about economic and social policy, that it's hard to give priority to one or another. But it's basically what people are angry about is that this is an extreme free market economy imposed during dictatorship, with a constitution also imposed during dictatorship, which was not democratically approved or designed. And for the past 30 years, under civilian rule, it has only gotten worse. Water has been privatized. Everything has been privatized. And there's a lack of regulation, lack of caps on pricing, on corporate profit, a lot of abuse by market forces. So this is a very kind of radical free market economy. And macroeconomic indicators seem fine. I mean, we have relatively low inflation, relatively low unemployment, but there's a lot of underemployment. Salaries are very, very low. Prices go up. I mean, housing, electricity, water, the prices of goods and services, because also our highways were also privatized, and people have to pay, and truckers especially have to pay a high tax just to go through the highway. So that makes goods and services, goods very expensive as well, and people are fed up with it. Pensions are extremely low, and that originates from the privatized social security system, also under dictatorship. So what we can see is that it's basically the economic model and the social policy imposed during dictatorship, which reached a boiling point last week. And it was just one little tiny raise in the subway fare, but that unleashed, and high school students started evading the metro, paying the metro. And that kind of unleashed all sorts of rage, and it was just like a boiling pot of water that exploded. And that's where a lot of the violence occurred too, a lot of looting, a lot of the arson. But you can see that it's against the transportation system, it's against big chains of supermarkets and pharmacies, which also have very, very highly priced medicine. So it wasn't against local shops or poor neighborhoods. It was very kind of directed. And it was an overall backlash of 30 years of market abuse and poor standards of living and really high living. In light of all of this, what the president did last week was just so minor. It really didn't address the big issues of the day. It was also fast-tracking legislation that's already before Congress, raising the minimum salary a little bit, raising pensions a little bit, an attempt to raise corporate tax a little bit, but it doesn't say anything about all the huge, enormous structural reforms that we're asking for. And in the first place, a new constitution.
The new constitution is one of the big issues that protesters are calling for, and just a reaction of President Pinera. The cabinet reshuffle and, new social reforms, including a 20% rise in basic pensions and a monthly minimum wage increase of a few dollars, from $413 to about $481. And the protesters seem to be continuing. Do you think that he's going to maybe relook or call for a relook of the Constitution and sort of work towards putting in place a new Constitution before he eventually, if the people don't get their way, whether he resigns or he continues by giving the people what they want?
I don't think the president will resign at all. I think what's going to happen is there's a growing momentum for a new constitution, and the political parties that were in power for 20 years earned a civilian rule, which didn't really do much about this back then, are now realizing they have to use their political power in Congress, especially because none of this movement is led or oriented by any political party or politician. But Congress can definitely start pushing through new legislation to make the reform necessary while civil society organizes and pushes for a new constitution. And that is probably, the demand is to have a constituent assembly, which we never had. So that takes a long time. But meanwhile, Congress can push through a lot of reforms. Instead of the president saying, we're going to raise just a few dollars on minimum pension, which is subsidized by the state, just reform the entire Social Security system. And that can be done without a new constitution while a new constitution is in place. So the government has had to, or should have to, change its entire agenda if it wants to have these protests subside.
Now, Prof, where to from here for the protesters? You mentioned earlier that there aren't really any leaders who are leading this protest. It's just people on the streets who have come out and are tired and are saying enough is enough. Where to from here?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's the question everyone's asking. And I assume that the government is just waiting for everyone to get exhausted, but at least it's been 2 weeks of everyday protests. And I think the government and political parties realize that there's no turning back, and that if they don't act according to the circumstances, they'll feel it in the polls in the next election, presidential, municipal, legislative election. But there has been a coalition of about 120 social and labor organizations called Social Unity, Unidad Social, which has kind of de facto organized local assemblies and is kind of systematizing and organizing these citizen proposals. So that's going on at the same time as these protests. And I think that legislators are realizing they have to serve the people and be at the service of the people instead of serve themselves. They've already changed their legislative agenda. The first day they went back to work when the protest began, Congress was supposed to discuss a pension reform introduced by the government, which no one liked, and they ended up discussing a bill presented by communist legislators that would reduce the work week from 44 hours to 40 hours, and that was immediately approved. The time was right for that. So I think that's what's going to happen. There's going to be some sort of back and forth with the government, politicians. A number of business men, basically, because they're men, are saying that they realize they have to dig deep into their pockets. They're open to paying more taxes or more corporate taxes, and that they're going. They know that Chile changed, and I think what they most want is stability, and that's the only way to get it is to do their part.
Prof, thank you so much for your time and thank you for joining us on The Globe this evening.